appreciate you coming in and doing this podcast.
You're very welcome.
You're from the area, Clearwater, right?
Well, I'm originally from Australia.
Oh, yeah.
I'm originally Australian, but I live here in Palm Harbor now, which is just, for people not in this area, it's just north of Clearwater.
Okay.
And when I first came to the United States in 1975, when Scientology first moved into Clearwater, obviously I lived here.
Okay.
And then I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles. But
okay. So you were, just for people out there who may not know your story, you were one of the top senior executives at the Church of Scientology. Number 2 to David Miscavige, I believe. And you were pretty high up there, right? Really close to him for a long time. And why don't you just go ahead and give us like a brief background of how you got started in all this?
Well, I got started through my parents. I was introduced to Scientology when I was 6 years old by my parents in Australia, and I was really raised as a Scientologist. And when I graduated high school, I joined the C organization, which is Scientology's inner core of most dedicated elite members. It's sort of like the Vatican, I guess, or some very, very hardcore. You sign a billion-year contract and dedicate yourself to achieving the aims of Scientology. And I went initially to join L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, on his boat in the Mediterranean, which was called the Apollo. And Hubbard had left England and was being pursued by various government agencies, and he decided in 1966-67 that he was going to sort of escape government oversight, and he bought 3 ships. And the largest of them was called the Apollo, and he hung out on the Apollo and sailed around in the Mediterranean and then ultimately into the Caribbean. And that was the people from the Apollo in the Caribbean who then moved ashore here to Clearwater in late 1974, early 1975. And I was with Hubbard throughout that time period. And then when we came to Clearwater, or when we came ashore from the Apollo, I was actually one of the very first people that came to the Fort Harrison. I was there when it was still the Jack Tar Hotel before Scientology had taken possession of it.
Wow.
I sort of rose in the ranks of Scientology ultimately to become the international spokesperson for Scientology, on the board of directors of the Church of Scientology International, which is the mother church of Scientology, and the head of what's known as the Office of Special Affairs. And the Office of Special Affairs is a very euphemistic sounding, or very euphemistic name for the department of Scientology that deals with external matters, which includes external threats, which means taking care of the enemies of Scientology.
Right.
And that history, when L. Ron Hubbard died in 1986, there was a sort of a vacuum created. He didn't leave any specific, clear instructions about what was to happen after he croaked, and David Miscavige, the current leader of Scientology, ultimately prevailed in a sort of power struggle and took over and has followed in the footsteps of Hubbard since then. So initially I worked for Hubbard, but then I started working for Miscavige when he took over, and I was, along with another guy called Marty Rathbun, sort of the two people who dealt with all external matters for Scientology. The IRS exemption, dealing with governments, dealing with legal cases, with the media, with all anything that had to do with Scientology's relationship to the world and the difficulties that may be having PR-wise or legal-wise.
Wow. So what was it like being around L. Ron Hubbard, and how old were you at that time?
I was 18 when I first arrived. I just turned 18 when I first arrived on the Apollo with Hubbard. He was a very larger-than-life character. He was a large man, just physically, but he was also had this sort of commanding presence of, you knew when he walked in a room, even if you didn't see him. He was just a big, narcissistic, but somewhat humorous, but crazy, but super smart. But like this, the enigmas surrounding L. Ron Hubbard are kind of hard to describe. There is a very, very brilliant book written by an English author called Russell Miller that is an unauthorized biography of L. Ron Hubbard. And that book, Barefaced Messiah, is the best insight into the life of Hubbard. Hubbard was at heart, he was a bullshitter. He was a storyteller. He made his living writing fiction works, science fiction, and other sorts of pulp fiction. And he basically took his skill as a writer of fiction and turned it into a money-making proposition as the author of Scientology. And, there are things in Scientology that are that most people would agree with. It's not all nuts.
Right.
Like, there's enough of it that is sort of makes sense and does help some people and is pretty benign and interesting. What's sort of interesting about it is how cleverly it is constructed to have a sort of a face to the world and a presentation to new people that makes it kind of attractive and interesting. And only once you've immersed yourself in it more do you start to see the darker side.
Right.
But
yeah, it seems like it, and at least for face value, it seems like a very productive, get shit done, get rid of the negative influences in your life. And it's a very positive way to, be a better version of yourself in all aspects, at least for face value.
Well, that's what it promotes.
Right.
And like I said, there are aspects to it that are presented to the world that make it appear that way. Mm-hmm. The unfortunate truth is that there is a very dark underbelly to Scientology. And, that's what we really covered in the Aftermath series that Leah Remini and I did. Mm-hmm. And now we are covering on the podcast that we are doing, which is called Scientology Fair Game. And fair game is the real meat of the nasty business of Scientology, because fair game is the policy and practices that were laid out by L. Ron Hubbard to destroy enemies. And Danny, you wouldn't believe the detail that he went into on how you go about doing that. And this is all written in documents that are they're not readily available. They're much more available now. WikiLeaks has got a bunch of them. I've put a bunch of them on my blog. They've sort of leaked out over the years, but these are documents that say basically to harass, intimidate, trick, lie, destroy enemies. And enemies is, I put in quotation marks because in the Scientology or the Hubbard definition of enemy is anybody who disagrees with, questions, opposes, or criticizes Scientology in any way. It's not, you don't have to be an out-and-out criminal to be designated an enemy of Scientology.